We do not lack historical determinations of Mannerism. There are expressionist, surrealist, Marxist, psychoanalytic, semiotic, and postmodern conceptions of Mannerism, to name but a few. And then there are also those who, precisely because of this very multiplicity, argue that Mannerism has never existed at all. This ambivalence and pluralism, however, is in fact essential to the philosophical concept of Mannerism. And it is also an essential component of our contemporary condition. Just as contemporary art actualizes trans-historical tendencies, the 16th century offers not a model for the present, but a futurity that is already included in it, and that allows for new alliances between the old and the new. In this book, Mannerism is not another name for the postmodern condition, but neither is it amodern, as Latour would have it. Rather, it is a different interpretation of modernity and modernism, a decentering one, which may shed new light on what it means to have been early modern, as well as measure the extent to which we continue to be modern today. Colin Rowe already spoke of a Mannerist modern movement in which modern architecture discovers ways of regenerating itself, exemplified by the repetition of Sébastien Serlio's blind windows and niches in Le Corbusier's Villa Schwab, 1912. More recently, Peter Eisenman, is another architect, has pointed to a Mannerist lateness in Adolf Loos, Aldo Rossi, and John Hajduk, in whose designs the intransience of conventions to history, the objectivity of style, and expression, subjectivity of style, produces a temporal ambiguity. Treading in the footsteps of Theodore Adorno, he claims that lateness is different from the modern relationship to history, which focused on a break with precedent, and different from the postmodern relationship to history, which focused on citation and a return to past historical cycles. Thus, Mannerism is syntactic rather than citational. It is not a system of sterile linguistic signs to be varied at will, but of vital gestures that insist in and apart from the present. Every material, say a building or a language, is a body with its own character, that is, its proper, historically grown, obstinacy, virtus. This constitutes the implicit potential of its linear development or explication, to the extent that we already know what the end product must be like. The implicit is generally passed over. Yet virtuosity is a matter of showing what a given material can do in a repetitive gesture. The mannerist re-implicates her or himself in it by asking the complicating, infinitizing, speculative question, what else is it capable of? Of what other modes of accomplishment?
It's okay.
Nowadays, this... Go on.
I was going to say, the only note I was going to make was the difference between citation and a syntactic syntacticism. What I find interesting about being syntactic is whenever I think of syntactic hooks, I think of the CCRU like double bracket, right? Or how the how the triple quotation mark denotates like a dog whistle rather than like a genuine held point of belief. So it's interesting how just by amplifying the grammar of something, we can attain something like materially different than creating a new term, right? Instead, we can just amplify the previous signal. Or with brackets, for example, an open-ended bracket. Hello.
All right, I'm back. Sorry about that.
Welcome back.
Good.
Welcome.
With brackets, like an open-ended bracket refers to like something which may be added in later. I think in the CCAU they go further and they say like you could add brackets anywhere to something that imply that in the future a future thing may be put here as recursion, right? But nothing needs to be within the brackets them to imply like an empty zone. And it's these empty zones of reference which we constantly refer back to, which give a sort of organicity to something as inorganic as grammar or structure.
Yeah, and it also kind of
I thought that was an interesting sentence, that thus mannerism is syntactic rather than citational.
because
Yes.
it goes
Just
back to that.
because you're talking about it's placing it's about the ordering of things, not references to past things.
Yes.
Yeah, there's no
Right.
when you're doing a citation, you're referencing like a source of information or an origin point. But we mentioned in the last lecture that mannerism doesn't really have any origin point. So it kind of goes back to that idea that it's a gesture, right? Because it's syntactic, so it's what it is it's more just an arrangement of words and phrases rather than referencing a source point.
Absolutely. The very nature of like a lot of this mannerist art is that it's seething, swarming, teeming, rather than well, I guess the man in this image is about 40, so he must have been born about 40 years ago. It's like, oh, but did you notice the dead like embryo in his eyes? Is that 40 years old? Like, no, not quite. Is it even alive? Like, no, not quite. Right? So there's a very like bargaining element to it all, but there's like a limit between it's like the exact we have this conception of biopolitics and necropolitics, right? Which is interesting because it leads us to treat death and awkward distance in modernity, or like whatever stage you're at now, post-modernity or fucking late capitalism, whatever you want to call it, right? We treat death at this awkward distance because we don't know how to suffer, to put it blankly. And I don't say that in some kind of on like I want to reduce all the honor from this argument. There's a lot of people who say we don't know how to suffer. We need to have a national service, put more children in war, teach them the meaning of life, that kind of thing, which is ghoulish. It's ghoulish. Obviously, it's ghoulish, right? We don't have to argue against that. But the value of life shouldn't be an arithmetic value, I suppose, right? I digress. You can continue if you'd like.
I was also just going to point out really quickly, it's very interesting in the part where he says every material, say a building or a language, is a body with its own character. That is, its proper historically grown obstinacy. And then he puts in brackets the word virtus, which we would associate with the Latin word virtue and meaning courage. But I'm not sure why he would say obstinacy and then put the Latin word for courage in brackets.
Well, it's because you can't spell brave without rave. Sorry.
Obstinacy. It's like a virtuous overcoming courage. Is the way I read the word. It's But it's just an interesting choice of word to put after obstinacy.
Maybe treating persistence as a virtue in that instance.
But is obstinacy? It's an interesting, perhaps, juxtaposition of the two words.
What were you gonna say, Brad?
Going back to the syntactic structure of it all. I don't quite have this thought fleshed out, but I feel like it sort of goes back to the animated quality of these Mannerist paintings, because usually when you have a syntactic structure, it'll usually follow like subject, verb, object. And so in these Mannerist paintings, you have all of these different subjectivities, like maybe a carrot and a thing of lettuce.
Object.
And then, then after the subjectivities, you have a verb or an action statement. And in these Mannerist paintings, it is almost like they're moving or they're taking on an action of themselves. And in the end, you have the object. And in the end of the Mannerist painting, it does sort of create this sort of ordered object that you're looking at. So yeah, that was the last one.
In that the objects have to be in a certain order to make the sentence.
Yes.
To form the syntax.
Yeah.
There's a very interesting relation.
Yeah.
I promise this will be my final point, and we can get back to reading. There's a very interesting relation here to neural networks. I know it's a bit of a boring subject when it's brought up at first for people, but there's a lot of when regarding like transformer architecture or a lot of these structures which are the application of like what we dub artificial intelligence today as they work on something called vector space, which is essentially just like a conceptual space which you can think about in 3D terms if you want to because it's useful, but like the vector space doesn't quite work in 3D terms. But it's essentially just like, hey, here's a point of reference, here's another point of reference. What's the weight between these two connections, right? Is it strong? Is it weak? Are these points far apart? And in generating a lot of information to a token level, a token just being an abstracted like amount of information, you end up getting these relations between object clusters, which are very interesting. Like all of a sudden, you have, say, like let's take a very grounded example in like a large language model, which is say ChatGPT or something, right? It's a large language model where all their tokens are text-based tokens. And they're just taking words and generating feedback responses. What happens there is they are able to like piece together nuances in language which we naturally piece together too, like the subtle delineation between lavender as a color and lavender as a flower. They know these things too because of the weights and biases and training, right? But also this can come to like quite concrete like observations when this is actually kind of the genesis of hallucinations. What's dubbed as hallucinations, sorry, in some of these models, because hallucinations obviously are very anthropomorphizing for it. But this sort of connection which is made, which is seemingly not true, but is obviously implicated somewhere in the system. Sorry, I kind of lost the thread of thought a little bit, but yeah, sorry. Maybe
well, you do need like
the
ordering in that AI in order for it to pick up on all those
things.
differences, right? And going back to what Jay was saying, for
Change
ordering
the
to
object,
make sense of it.
yeah.
We can take an example like a sentence like the cat chased the mouse. You have the subject being the cat, the action verb being chased, and the object being the mouse. And if you took either of those out, it would fall apart, but all of them together create this sort of animated image, like mannerism.
And what's amazing as well is you take Japanese, which is not a subject it's not a subject object verb language. It's a subject verb object language, right? Actually,
I think it's the other way around.
Either or.
Other way around, object verb.
You're right. I was about to say, so the action always comes at the end of the sentence in like Japanese, for example. If you want to say I speak Japanese, in English it's I speak Japanese, right? I being the object, speak being the action, Japanese being the subject. Whereas in Japanese, you would say, I think it would be
Nihongo or
Nihongo
skoshi.
or hanashimasu ka? Yeah. Well,
Because I was going to say, because structurally what's happening is you're specifying the actors involved and before you specify the action.
Yes, that's right. You're setting the pieces and then knocking them down at the end. And I imagine that makes a lot of sense if you've learned your whole life. That's the way things should be. Which is why language is so interesting to me in that sense. It's like grammatical imposition, which, because we all have like an inherent grammar somewhere, but like it's not necessarily bound to a national language as such. I sort of fuck with Chomsky quite a lot when he says, we all speak our own dialect. We all speak our own language, right? It's not just dialect. It's like we all speak something different. We just come to communicate, right? And that's kind of why Japanese can be a little bit disarming sometimes, because I feel like as an English speaker learning Japanese, I feel like I never understand anything until the very end of a sentence. Which is where all the action is stuffed right at the end. So I'm like waiting for that end bit, right? Which kind of almost like forces me to like listen in a way, right? Whereas I can imagine if you're like going the other way around and like you can intuit then from the middle, I imagine that could be like a comforting break almost for other people coming from the outside, like going towards that. I was almost about to say outside in, which is a gross statement. But like you can imagine, like it doesn't matter what you start with when it comes to grammar. Any other grammar is freeing, right? Like with Russian, for example, there are no imperfect tenses in Russian. And that's why the stereotypical Russian accent, when translated to English, they drop all definitive clauses or indefinite clauses. They don't say a hill, they just say hill. Or they don't say like the mole, they say mole, right? There's no indefinite clauses in Russian. But in my mind, as an English speaker, that makes Russian an extremely elegant language, right? Like, if I want to say my mother was speaking to me on the... I disconnected for a second, I'm sorry. If I want to say my mother was speaking to me on the phone on the train, that's like 11 words, 12 words. My mother was speaking to me on the phone on the train. That's like 12 words, right? In Russian, it's 3 fucking words.
You say mother, phone, train, done.
Literally, quite literally, yeah. Like, it's an extremely elegant language in my mind, to be honest. I think it's quite beautiful. I digress a lot, but I think there's a lot we can learn from like ping-ponging between different like languages.
Yeah, you learn a lot about grammar and a lot about culture. And I think for most Americans, you probably learn grammar through learning another language. You probably don't remember those grammar sheets in middle school.
I could tell you right now, the only reason I have any recollection of how sentence structure properly works is partially because I write recreationally, and then partially because of having an interest in trying to learn other languages.
Yeah.
And trying to get my head around, what do you mean it doesn't work like that? What?
Yeah.
Which is another big benefit for trying to learn those other languages for people who don't speak them in the first place, is being able to get your head around working within those different frameworks that happen, because I imagine that sort of like linguistic framework does kind of bleed out into the rest of the culture.
Yeah.
Really. I mean, like a language cannot but touch its nation, right?
Exactly.
What plays into your point, Joey, is that if like you learn a language or for me, at least for me, so it's that way. If you learn a language which is like very similar to your own language, it's or similar but slightly different. It's really agonizing because you think you see like a frame of reference, but then it isn't the way you expect it to be. But it
uncanny valley linguistically,
like it should be the same, and that's makes it harder, at least in my opinion, than, for example, for me learning English, because English is very I think it's elegant as well, like in quite a similar way you see Russian.
You're German, aren't you, babes?
Yeah.
Yeah, how could I have guessed? No, you have a beautiful voice.
Thank you.
Yes, I understand what you mean. There are some bait words sometimes, aren't there? Like some words you think there should be comfort in, yet they are not what you. I think they're called homophones, right?
Oh
Words
man, the
that
super
sound
annoying
similar.
thing is in Dutch, will means want.
Yes.
So it's kind of annoying like that.
Yeah, as like an English speaker, I felt like an absolute
As an English
privilege.
speaker.
Sorry, as an English speaker, I felt like I had an absolute privilege when I went to Amsterdam, and like, I just never for a second considered learning Dutch, not even for a microsecond, because like, literally anyone you speak to will speak English back to you.
You try to speak to them in Dutch, and a lot of times they'll probably go, "That's really nice of you to try, but can we do this in English, please?"
It doesn't even get to that point, because I think the Dutch already understand that they're speaking English half the time anyway. So it's not even like there's that sort of American oh, I want to prove to the French I can speak French, and the French like chat some shit back. There's not even that like back channeling. Hi, Marky.
Hey,
Good
sorry.
evening.
Hi.
Eagle class.
Did the class stop?
Yeah. We kind of were just talking about random stuff towards the end, or just like
No worries.
different people Hegel inspired, or people, or inspired in the other direction, I guess.
Hi, Spencer.
Miss all Amanda.
Good evening.
We are poaching. Oh, hello, Jack. We are poaching. Oh,
Good evening.
Because I turned up, that's what it is.
Yes. You might.
Yeah, it's definitely you, Robert. Sorry.
I have invoked the masses.
In one word or less, what is mannerism?
Oh,
Kidding.
Matty.
It's the time. It's the time space that we're living through right now.
That was not one word or less, but I'll take your answer.
It's such a mess up topic.
Mannerism is noodle arms.
So you might have noticed I just posted a picture of the Burj Al Khalifa Tower in the Mannerist chat. And the reason why is because a little while back in the conversation it hit on, they started building the tower, and then at a certain point, they used AI to run the modeling through a computer system, and they realized they could build it much higher. It could withstand the weight, and they could build it higher than they had originally planned. So the top part of it is actually built by AI. It's like
wow.
the point of the sword rising up from the sword, basically.
This is like Tower of Babel
Oh.
2.0.
Is it not just? And
Wait,
this is actually a sickeningly un-environmentally friendly building.
Doesn't surprise me in the slightest.
It's all the
Which,
birds
Yeah,
running into
which
it.
I'm not going to get into, but if you look it up, there are plenty of documentaries on it. It requires 4 sort of power stations and pumping stations around its base just to circulate cool water around the building so that it remains habitable.
Jeez.
Not to mention the occupants' water consumption unto themselves.
Yeah, it is like a vacuum on energy. And
there is a there's actually a line, I think, in the Mannerism book, if I can pull from it. I think it was about page 6, which talks about you hit the very tip of the building, right?
yeah,
And there's a line, I think, about page 6 in the Mannerism book, which
the
is
tip of the sword rising up from the
Yes.
sword. Yeah,
Absolutely. Yeah,
yeah,
instead of leading back to an unchanging and more perfect foundation, it would be better to say that the different modes or manners rise up from being, like the tip of the sword from the sword. And that's kind of, yeah, like when you show this, like,
yeah.
is this building perfected to a point, to a T? I just can't help but think about that.
Yeah, it hit me as well, that.
Yeah, the Mannerist
Mm.
world is one of spontaneous duplications and reduplications that endlessly redistribute what it means to exist.
And at the same time, data at its essence is always multiplicative.
Mm. Should we...
So,
Oh, go ahead. Go ahead.
oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, you go ahead.
Oh, okay. Well, what I was going to say was, it's really, really nice to have you guys in here, Jack, Matty, and Spencer. Yeah. Sorry, I was like, oh, I wasn't sure if it was okay to. He wasn't sure if it was okay.
Names are hard.
Names can be hard sometimes. To have you guys. I know you guys weren't here for the first reading, but we are reading the Philosophy of Mannerism, which is the PDF in the little Discord, in the Mannerism chat. I think you guys might be able to see it if you scroll up a little bit there. Do all of you guys comfortable with reading along, or would you like anyone to screen for you?
If there is a screen available, that'd be awesome. I could pull it up too, but just so I could track
Would
where y'all are.
anybody? Sure. Is anybody willing to do that? Brad, I don't know if you. I know you got OBS up, right?
I do
the
have
Velociraptor of it.
OBS.
Thank you so much. All right.
Swag.
And I'm going to read on from the. You'll see the bracketed word virtus, and then the next line. It's the very last 3 words of the bottom of page 7.
Didn't
page
you were
7.
starting on nowadays? I thought on page 8.
Well,
Am I nowadays?
Let's just.
Oh yeah, did we read it?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I mean, we could do a very big gratitude and just reread from the metamodernism paragraph.
Yeah, for sure.
The newest people. Would that be
Shall I
okay
read
with
from
you,
the
Jack?
top there? Yeah,
Would you like to read from the start of the metamodernism? Because it's a news break, so it would be nicer for people getting into it.
Yeah. And if they scroll up through the images on the Mannerist channel, they'll see the pictures of Le Corbusier's Villa Schwab and Sebastian Serlio's blind windows. Yeah, so if you want to check some of the images there, they are there. Here we go, metamodernism. We do not lack historical determinations of mannerism. There are expressionist, surrealist, Marxist, psychoanalytic, semiotic, and postmodern conceptions of mannerism, to name but a few. And then there are also those who, precisely because of this very multiplicity, argue that mannerism has never existed at all. This ambivalence and pluralism, however, is in fact essential to the philosophical concept of mannerism, and it is also an essential component of our contemporary condition. Just as contemporary art actualizes trans-historical tendencies, the 16th century offers not a model for the present, but a futurity that is already included in it and that allows for new alliances between the old and the new. In this book, mannerism is not another name for the postmodern condition, but neither is it amodern, as Latour would have it. Rather, it is a different interpretation of modernity and modernism, a decentering one, which may shed new light on what it means to have been early modern, as well as measure the extent to which we continue to be modern today. Colin Rowe already spoke of a Mannerist modern movement in which modern architecture discovers ways of regenerating itself, exemplified by the repetition of Sebastian Serlio's blind windows and niches in Le Corbusier's Villa Schwab, 1912. More recently, Peter Eisenman, is another architect, has pointed to a Mannerist lateness in Adolf Loos, Aldo Rossi, and John Hajduk. Also, I imagine these are all architects, in whose designs the intransience of conventions to history, the objectivity of style, and expression, subjectivity of style, produces a temporal ambiguity. Treading in the footsteps of Theodor Adorno, he claims that lateness is different from the modern relationship to history, which focused on a break with precedent, and different from the postmodern relationship to history, which focused on citation and a return to past historical cycles. Thus, mannerism is syntactic rather than citational. It is not a system of sterile linguistic signs to be varied at will, but of vital gestures that insist in and apart from the present. Every material, say a building or a language, is a body with its own character, that is, its proper, historically grown obstinacy, virtus. This constitutes the implicit potential of its linear development, or explication, to the extent that we already know what the end product must be like. The implicit is generally passed over, yet virtuosity is a matter of showing what a given material can do in a repetitive gesture. The mannerist re-implicates her or himself in it by asking the complicating, infinitizing, speculative question: what else is it capable of? Of what other modes of accomplishment?
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Shall I read on again like this?
Yeah.
I'd like, if it's okay, Jay, I just want to like put a. So first of all, Matty, did you want to say something?
I had a thought. I have or at least an example or a few examples, but I'll stick to one. This basically, I'm a skateboarder. This reminds me of skateboarding. That's the short way of saying this. But specifically, when they say what is this capable of, and what other modes of accomplishment are like possible in a sense. I don't know how familiar you all are with street skateboarding, but like basically what happens is like a group of skateboarders will go either driving around or skating around. They'll find an object or a system of objects and will say try to figure out or discover what can be done on that obstacle. You could be going over it. You could be grinding the surface. You might need to wax it in some way, or break it down with like a brick to make it smooth. You might again going over it, grinding it in some way, sliding on it. Basically, two different materials are kind of combining in that way. But again, those things are not meant to be wrote on in that way, right? Like there's a certain like definite like approach that's intended, right? Like the intended use of a bench is to sit on it, right? And the hostile architecture of it would be like, oh well, we don't want you sleeping on it, so and we don't want you skateboarding on it, so we're gonna put these like notches. I can't think of the right word.
Notches, yeah.
Could be spikes.
Notches, modules, spikes is another example.
Right. Anything like that.
Hostile architecture.
Hostile architecture, and it doesn't have to be against specifically skateboarding. It's usually towards homeless people. It just kind of works as a function against both, but but there's a definitive way of how to approach the space, which is important, and that's already kind of predetermined. And I don't know. I don't know if this is exactly what they're getting at, but
no, you're absolutely correct.
Like skateboarding or even graffiti or something is.
It changes how you view and interact with the space, what the space means to you, what potential is held within the space.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly.
In fact, actually, something you said, Matty, in one of the very last bits of the place where we left off, yet virtuosity is a matter of showing what a given material can do in a repetitive gesture. So the idea that actually habit is instructing us what we do with the bench, rather than, oh, I was told I may be able to sit on the bench, so I sit on it. It's like, no, actually, you see other people repeatedly sitting on the bench, so you sit on it. But also, if you never saw people sitting on a bench and you only saw people grinding on it with a skateboard, then obviously you'd come to believe that it just exists for a skateboarder's paradise.
Yeah.
So it's that's so interesting, the balance here. Yeah.
Yeah, it's like for skateboarding, there's a sort of animated rebellion that reorganizes what there is to gesture at something new. So like, does that stair set stand for stairs, or is it a launch pad? And it kind of relates to mannerism in that way too. Are those vegetables or is it a human? Sorry.
I think no, it's all good. It's all good. It's a very creative interpretation of how skateboarders like view the world around them. So thank you for bringing that up, Matthew. I think there was one point I wanted to make very briefly. I hope I'm not dominating the space, which was I think it was first of all not to the point you are, guys, Jack and Spencer. Do you guys have any questions about what we're talking about?
Pardon me a moment, I gotta go rescue my cat from the other room.
No worries, right, go for it. I'm glad you're chill, Jack. Hope you're alright as well, Spencer. In that sense, the easiest 30-second sort of update I can give you for the previous 7 pages, or I guess to kind of talk about mannerism or talk around mannerism, just to give a foothold here. Just for everyone who's coming in today, would I hope this is appropriate. It would probably be similar to. Does everyone here understand what happens when new music is produced and then we label it as a genre of music? and there's like some interesting connections that happen at the imposition of the labeling of the genre. And I will expand a little bit. So like, for example, and this relates to mannerism pretty heavily. What will happen in the arts is people experiment and they play, right? We're all playing with bodies and things. And then good shit happens. And then sometimes when like the right arrangement or the right like chords or concordment of bodies happens, we think, oh, this is kind of really vibing amongst a particular theme. I feel like we should call this something. And then we name it as a genre of music, right? But there's a very peculiar thing that happens at the imposition of the genre, which is as soon as we analyze something as being worthy of being folded within a genre, people from the outside look at the genre and they look at the genre's defining features of musicality, and they'll start ripping it apart. All of a sudden, they'll start deconstructing it, right?
It's like naming it in that way gives them a framework for being able to deconstruct it in a sense.
Mm-hmm.
Capturing
like,
it.
Absolutely. It's like there's an upward thrust as well as a downwards like disintegration, right? You kind of open yourself up to be devoured the moment that you name yourself as being a thing worthy of being tasty, right? And within genres, right? They sort of like they analyze dubstep and be like, oh, well, what actually makes dubstep dubstep? And then they can pin all these modalities to it, and then XYZ is what it is. But the thing is, people continue to make things regardless. And I feel like the reason I brought this up in the first place was because this is perhaps potentially floating around the essence of what a mannerism is as an architectural style. This is the reason why people might argue it never existed at all. Because mannerism as an architectural style is doing a very similar thing, where it's not clapping itself down and saying, I'm here doing this. It's just doing without naming. And so that's the sort of like relevance that I wanted to bring to you guys for this book.
Gesturing without naming, that's a really key point.
I'm going to be swapping over to mobile here for a beat, so unfortunately my capacity to stream this is going to die for a little while.
No worries. Who's if anyone needs a co-streamer, if anybody else could do that, that'd be nice.
What is a co-stream? Oh, to stream the page?
Yeah, just fucking streaming the book, yeah.
So I'll be honest, my computer's been doing fine, even though I'm recording OBS. So I could do that.
Thank you very much, Ocean. I appreciate it.
I'm gonna share.
It's nice to like split the tasks a little bit.
All right.
That's all right. We've got some multiple.
How's that?
It kind of reminds me of like the difference in repetition, I guess, like masks on masks on masks. Is that kind of what's happening? Like chapter 1 of difference or repetition?
Oh, very much so. Yeah. No, actually, it does. I didn't even realize I had those vibes until you brought it up, and I was like, wait, yeah, I had been thinking that way too.
Just trying to ground. Y'all have a little bit more ahead than I am on this, so I was just curious.
Only 7 pages. Honestly, if in your own time, if you read these 7 pages, they're gorgeous. Like, you'd like it.
It looks interesting.
We are fully capable of moving forward if you guys want to.
I was just about to say, on that note of beautiful sentences, should we... Jay, do you want to keep reading, or do you want someone else to read?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'd love to.
Okay, for sure.
Let's keep track at it, man.
So we're on this, the second paragraph of page 8 now.
That's right. Cool.
Nowadays, this question of the use of bodies returns with a concept such as metamodernism, instead of a parody and pastiche of clearly defined historical moments. Other repetitions have already replaced the classical chronology with a wave that knows only singular manners, each of which re-virtualizes the actuality of modernism in its own way. Just as historical mannerism was the hyperbole of the Renaissance, in which the mastery of primary geometry or the depiction of the human figure was put to unnatural use, there is also a virtuoso modernity in which any given material or technique is pushed to its limit and tested for further artificial becomings. Giorgio Agamben suggests that the word modern comes from the Latin modo, meaning just now, a temporal gap or tension between the present and its immediate past. Mannerism, in other words, is not so much an ironic critique of the past as an intensification of its genetic moments and an expansion of memory. Instead of a critique of originality or authenticity, it is the repetition of the forces of a past potential that never was and could never be fully actual. It is a prenatal modernism.
Keep going.
In their conjunction, both mannerism and modernism become something quite different from what canonical art history makes of them. Mannerism is perhaps more modern than modernism, but in the sense of a non-modern dialect that reverses their priority. Modernism already stirs in the 16th century in the guise of a mannerist classicism, but only begins to rediscover its own rupture by the end of the 19th century. This explication of its own mannerist condition has perhaps culminated in postmodernism, which is sterile precisely because it suffices with manipulating established codes and recreating what it already knows. Nevertheless, as the ongoing self-historicization of art in terms of beginnings, breaks, and ends is replaced by ahistorical and non-artistic forces, should we not rather say that modernism itself is now absorbed into a mannerism of cosmic proportions, and that its temporality exceeds any essential relation to the 20th century? I think I should do this one more paragraph here.
Yeah, you said this
In contemporary...
you said this explication. It's actually explicitation, which is...
Explicitation, where is it?
Here, this...
explicitation, yeah. The making explicit of its own mannerist condition has perhaps culminated in postmodernism, which is sterile precisely because it suffices with manipulating established codes and recreating what it already knows. So if you think about, this brings to mind immediately Jameson saying that it's just images which contain more images, like it's an endless repetition.
Yeah, an endless succession, being crushed by an endless succession of cars. I understand. I'm actually very interested in reading more. If you'd like to keep going, Jay, I'd be more than happy.
Wonderful. In contemporary aesthetics, yeah. Oh, does anyone want to come in with thoughts?
No, I'm okay.
I'm good.
Also, this brought to mind, Joby, if you think of Marx saying all the elements of a system must fully be worked through before it can break through into the next system. It's like using something, pushing it till it sort of bends or breaks. Everything must be fully done, like right till the very last point before the next thing breaks through.
That's interesting because that's at odds with what Marx thought Hegel was proposing, in a sense, where Hegel was obsessed with a world that precedes itself, or a world that. So Hegel's philosophical project was his project was a philosophy that completes philosophy, or a world that sort of precedes itself. And in that sense, it was more. He was concerned with finding the dialectical triumph, if that's safe to say, and what was I going to say? Okay, so when Marx antagonizes against this act, because obviously when Marx takes Hegel and says, well, if you think about the world this way, then the world's just like an infinite production of conveyor belts. Then what do we get? We get factories, and we get factories where actually it's not about the end product, but more so getting everything set up to get the first product out. And I think that's got some relevance for the conversation here.
Yeah, something going on that idea of explicitation too, where you're making things more explicit that are originally implicit, right? There does sort of seem to be a covering up in that high Renaissance period where you're focusing on a preconceived ideal that you kind of, that comes from the outset that you put onto something, whereas Mannerism, it's almost like everything gets laid bare in Mannerism. Like a lot of the paintings, they almost, even if it's sea life, even if it's vegetal life, it almost looks like entrails or like stuff like that. And even in these like buildings, like this insanely huge building that just scaffolds up to whatever the fuck, there's something like very bare about I don't know, maybe techno capital in it or something like that. But yeah.
I get you.
Yeah. Should we continue? There is someone typing. I'm not sure who it is, but if you want to,
I think it might be Matty, baby.
Just if you want to mute while typing, that would be lovely. I don't know if anyone wants to continue reading or want someone else to.
All right, now that I'm back at my desk, I can jump in for the reading.
Oh yeah, you wanna pick up doing the reading?
Like to?
Sure. We left off on, we were on to page 9, I do believe, weren't we?
The paragraph right above it.
Contemporary aesthetics. Let me read this next.
Oh, found it. There we go.
This one paragraph. Yeah, and then
I'll be able to pick up where you left off. Yeah.
Yeah.
Cool.
In contemporary aesthetics, Gilles Deleuze and Félix Guattari are the most rigorous theorists of this Copernican revolution. For them, modernism is not just the historical moment of the final crystallization of the canonical fine arts, each with its specific matter and form. Neither is it exhausted by the event that Alfred North Whitehead named the bifurcation of nature into the objective domain of science and the subjective domain of art. Rather, as perhaps prefigured in Russian constructivism, it is the moment when art becomes exclusively a question of technicity. the elaboration and assemblage of any material whatsoever charged with harnessing unformed and unlocalizable forces. Deleuze and Guattari speak of modern art as abstract machine and of the modern artist as cosmic artisan. We must become machinists, operators. But what is cosmic about the modern?
Sorry. At stake is the unity of the arts, the absolute or outside of the art that normally remains invisible. The classical artist found this unity in the pre-established harmony of God's creation, or rather, in the assumption of God's task as his own, to confront chaos with the creative organization of raw and untamed matter into stable, analytical relations of form and content. The Romantic artist saw himself as the privileged mediator of nature, or the earth producing itself as infinite and continuous variation of synthetic form, thus keeping the a priori unity of the earth even in its constant deterritorialization. That word's a little bit of a mouthful. The modern artist, by contrast, no longer confronts or mediates chaos through any kind of form at all, but immediately operates an informal synthesizer of matter energy. She inverts the genealogical relation between Earth and cosmos, or indeed between the infinite depth of the past and the unlimited finitude of the future. Nature is redistributed without reserve onto the disjunctive unity of the contemporary, where it is in fact indiscernible from an apocalyptic multiplicity. Words are hard.
Okay.
Any questions so far, or am I reading too fast?
No, that
That's
was just a
all
hell of a paragraph. I mean,
That is a heck of a paragraph there, yeah.
I mean, yeah, like the matter energy stuff is, I know that's from Deleuze and Guattari, but like, matter energy. I know that idea is like basically matter and movement, I think is all that means. So that would be like the flows of like information, the flows of water, sewage, food.
There's a monster down my gullet.
Right. Or even literally energy, right? Like fucking Wi-Fi and like
How are we
like
speaking right now,
power
you know?
lines. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, exactly.
So
Why is
pick it
it
up for
Security?
Why is it immediate? Is it just immediate just because we can get it in an instant?
What was the question?
Well, okay, they say it no longer confronts or mediates chaos to any kind of form at all, but immediately operates an informal synthesizer of matter energy. I guess I throw, maybe it's just because I just read Hegel, so I'm like kind of skeptical of this word immediate, but I'm assuming by immediate they're just saying like it's just we get it immediately, like I don't know.
Well, it's
Like
mediates
Looking at that point.
chaos. It does Mannerism doesn't mediate the chaos. So like going back to the idea that like high Renaissance comes from the outset with this preconceived idea that you put onto like a canvas or something like that. Mannerism is more like a gesture. So if we look at that word in synthesizer, right, it's usually for like an electronic musical instrument or a keyboard. So you have this keyboard with this set of this sort of ordering, but it's not like you have an ideal. You can play whatever the hell you want on the synthesizer. Yeah. I don't know that.
I guess I thought it was saying synthesizer more in like the Kantian sense. Like, I guess like it's interesting you're saying like the instrument. I was thinking of synthesize as in like bringing together like the manifold of things.
That too, definitely. Because like if you're looking at the Mannerist, what was that last thing you said? Bringing together the manifold of things.
Yeah, or like of a sensibility. probably be a better way to say it.
Well, if you look at I always go back to Vertumnus, but if you look at the Vertumnus painting, it's a bunch of vegetables that make a person's face or something, right?
Yeah.
And you have a manifold of subjectivities, like a carrot, a piece of lettuce, a tomato, stuff like that. But when you bring that manifold together, it creates this like vital matter energy or something, I guess.
Yeah,
And
I
it's
love-
flipping the view over to you, the viewer. You have to complete the piece of art
mhm.
as
Something
well.
else.
Unlike in that the earlier classical ideal, like you know what you're kind of looking for and what you're expecting, while this, it requires something of you to complete it.
I was very interested actually in the distance that you should take from art proper sometimes, like the sort of idea that for Mannerist art, it might be more acceptable to view it actually at distance, because we always view art at distance, right? It's not like we are groping and touching the Mona Lisa when we view her, right? In fact, most art we've always seen, unless you've been to a gallery, is at distance. But even when we're at a gallery, there's still distance, right? It's just installed intimacy, right? Or delayed intimacy. The idea of a sculpture is to fascinate those who see the sculpture, but the sculpture was not meant to go around the world, right? So we have a very warped view, I think, nowadays about what constitutes art, because all things are rendered as flat screen objects. So, in today's day and age, like we have like a bit of a weird bias surrounding art, which I can't quite touch upon. But for Mannerism of its time, sorry, go ahead. Sorry, Rabbit, did you want to say something?
No, you might have just been picking me up, breathing in the background. My microphone's a little close to my mouth.
I apologize. I was
No, you're all
oh
good.
my God.
Well,
I was like so
you do
sensitive to somebody else trying to jump in.
You do need healthy distance for intimacy.
For
That's
example,
also
a healthy
true.
distance between me and the microphone helps to improve that relationship there.
So
What I was
actually,
going to
that's the-
say, Joby, really
Go for it.
quick, is in the Low Countries at the end of the 15th century, just before this period, Dutch painted altarpieces had become like a highly popular thing. So pieces of art were traveling around even in that time before. People would buy art and sculptures, they'd order it from people in other cities.
Mhm.
And yeah, so it was just got me thinking to that, what you said.
Trickle down economics, baby.
Yeah.
There was the point I was gonna make, but I feel like I've lost it somehow because the tippy tappy typing.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
That's me.
Oh, baby, it's okay. It's all right. I like your keyboard sounds lovely, by the way. I'm glad I got to have my ear pressed to it. What was the original question? Sorry.
It was about the synthesizer and the how modern art no longer confronts or mediates chaos through any form, but immediately operates an informal synthesizer of matter energy.
It was the immediacy of it, yeah. So the final point I guess I want to make was on the immediacy of this art. The thing about Mannerism is I wasn't even aware of it until like 3 weeks ago. I'm going to be very honest. I think I raised this point in the first reading, but I'll raise it again. It's very easy to have a conception of art or of history, in fact, And through history of all human progression is like a linear progression, right? Throughout the ages, there were, you can expand this to anthropology too. We must have been monkeys, and then suddenly settler colonies, and then hunter-gatherers, and then I guess we discovered agriculture, and then I guess we discovered reason, and then I guess we discovered nation states, and we are all reasonable now from then on forward, right? And it's just not the case, particularly, right? Like it's not. There's like all of these awkward like adjacencies, that permeate history that we just don't talk about. Like, for example, with Mannerism, I think a lot of Mannerist, the reason why I hadn't really considered Mannerism as like an art form before, or I was aware of it, was because I just kind of took on the implicit ideology that was essentialized by, say, the Leviathan that Jay brought up in the first reading group. Jay, could you contextualize this for people who weren't here last time? Like the throughput with Leviathan and David Hume?
He posits the two images against each other in the section composition. So in the tradition of composite painting, that the frontispiece of Thomas Hobbes' Leviathan is typical of classicism. It is the organism of the sovereign subject composed of individual human souls who have emancipated themselves from the state of nature. The social body towers over the objectified earth as its master and possessor. Contrast this to Arcimboldo's grotesque portraits composed as crowded tableaux of animals, fruits, and vegetables. In both cases, we are dealing with highly artificial compositions, but the latter no longer reflects the power of the human subject. Both designs are highly anthropomorphic, but the latter is no longer anthropocentric. So it's about this humans being sort of in the middle, and well, now we're in that situation, as he says at the start, where humanity is the dumb observer and the world is sort of rising up against us again through climate change and etc.
Yeah, decenters humanity and recenters like other life form, whether it's vegetal life or sea life or even the life of architecture and stuff like that.
Is it the thing? If you believe in humanism and you believe in the rational soul and you believe in everything that like the world is trying to teach you, then you believe in this idea of a superiority or an ontology of like man above all in the animal kingdom. Like the intelligent mind will figure out a solution to animal exploitation or climate change or this, that, and the other, right? We just kind of think that we'll develop a technology to deal with that problem. We'll develop a technology to deal with that problem. Like
growing meat in a laboratory so no animals are actually harmed.
Or if that's not the case, we'll just cut out the brain stems of animals in farms and stack them vertically to farm them. That's also another choice. Like, and if anything, it's like
Mannerist animal flesh trees is basically what you're talking about.
Absolutely.
What I'm hearing,
animal flesh trees, isn't that horrible?
I'm hearing organic shawarma, like the shawarma pikes.
Shawarma pikes. Someone said immediately, and I mistakenly said, "Oh, the word wasn't immediately; it was mediates." My bad. Because rereading again, there obviously is immediately operates, right? And that does sort of trigger something, which is in Mannerist art, you really don't have to unpack any of the art to interpret it, whereas you probably would if you were trying to unpack a high Renaissance painting.
Yeah.
But at the same time, I'm not sure if Mannerism is like all surface level. At the
Oh,
same
it's
time,
absolutely not all surface level.
Yeah.
Like it's not like Mannerist art kills the author,
Yeah.
right? Because that's like the big point of like postmodern intent, or often is like, oh well, you know, the director is dead, the author is dead, all that exists is affect.
There is an element of that in it, though.
Well, there's an element, but that's the thing. The element is different to an encapsulating force, which is what I find so fascinating about it. It doesn't present itself as like an all-encompassing, like, oh, we told you so kind of moment. It's like, no, it's just like a truthful ebb and flow. And I love, not to speak over the book without having really read much of the book, but like what I'm enjoying so much about it so far is like this idea, is this instantiation that it's like perhaps mannerism is more modern than modernity itself. And like I see that when I actually look at some of these modern like mannerist pieces, and I see some of the like absolutely eclectic like tableaus and like the festering fucking acrid pieces of art that are like made. And it's not just like, oh, we made a building, or oh, we made a portrait. It's like, oh no, we also made roads, we made sculptures. Here's like Mary Magdalene with her like eyes gouging out of her head. Here's like a fetus in the eye of like Batumnus. Like it's like amazing, right? It just feels like so like infused with something, but there's like nothing you can really take from it. And I like that. I like the idea that like I cannot get my hands or hook my claws or just like scoop up everything that's there. I just sorry, gonna calm down. I like the book.
Well, it's like an infinite expression, basically. Like it's like can't be tied down to like a single set of like signifiers, right?
Yeah.
Kind of what you're saying, Joe?
Yeah, and if you look into why
very,
it
very
can't
much
be tied down, because like on the surface, people could say that a big amount of mannerism is it's artificiality, right? But you can't just say that it's only artificial, because a lot of mannerism has elegance or refinement, or a lot of mannerism has just very unusually complex and like elongated and exaggerated proportions to it. So like there's always this sort of unstable tension where it sort of focuses more on style than like,
yeah,
I don't know, maybe the naturalism that came before it.
Well, there's this idea I often get when I walk past like a construction site, which is, wow, such a natural place, right? Because we often, when we see like these steel beams and these like scaffolds and structures that are set up, a lot of people get the impression that like, oh, this is super man-made. But I'm like often thinking and reckoning, what's man-made about this? Like genuinely, like what's man-made about glass? Glass is sand, right? Is sand not like a natural property of like geo-erosion? You know, is glass not like a natural property of magma? And like when we think about like these like man-made artifices, it's man-made in the sense that we've stolen something from somewhere else, or if you don't like the term stolen because it's got
Picked
a
it
lot
up
of
and
heavy weight to
rearranged it.
Yeah, yeah. So like man-made, the artifice in general is like a spurious term. It's a very blurred boundary. There's really nothing that artificial about what we think is artificial, and yet it's a very unique distinction for example, like when we think about natural foods and processed foods, we've realized actually processed does not cover it. We need to actually come up with new terms. So if anything, now there are newer and newer and more emergent terms for processed and ultra processed foods now. So like we don't even it's not even like we can distinguish between one conveyor belt and 20. Now we need to talk about like supply chains in their totality. And it's kind of crazy to think about like how we're just recombining and reconstituting the elements of the earth to like service our needs. But that's kind of what Mannerist art does in a sense, where it reconstitutes all these elements into a singular, fantastical art piece that we can and ah about. And,
that reconstituting, rearranging, and blurring is also what makes Mannerism dynamic, dramatic, emotional, and intellectual and intellectual.
It reminds me of what Matty was talking earlier about skateboarding, where it's kind of like, okay, the world is as it is, but what if we fucking skated on it all, right?
Hell yeah!
Like,
yeah.
I think it's sick as fuck, right? Ocean was something you wanted to say, Davey?
Yeah, I'm just like it's not only the differentiation between things that are or that exist without human influence, but also to what an extent humans or human influence in itself is also natural. It goes further than just and it makes this differentiation even blurrier in a sense.
Completely. You are correct. There is this idea that at some point we separated from nature. That at some point we just I might be wrong in my genealogy here, so anyone feel free to flag me down if I'm incorrect. But around the time of the uh, Renaissance, I have this conception of all of life being natural and preordained when we had like the, sort of divine ontology and divine right kings and all that stuff. And then we start getting the Renaissance, we start breaking away from this sort of mode of thought. Then we have all these reformations, which are legally happening, like religiously, like these religious reformations which are happening within like England and then much of Europe, where all these churches are like converting and deconverting, and the stability of life is like to the people at the time is kind of like tumbling. And this is like the 16th century, 17th century, 15th century. It's like a big process. It's like a big shakeup of the sort of more natural ties that people would have had. This whole process precipitates like what people would have thought of as natural then, after sort of like intellectual revolution. I hate to call it intellectual. I really fucking apologize for that. But after the Italian Renaissance, when people start saying, well, maybe the reason for our existence should come from us rather than some like umpteenth other in the abstract. We then start to partition all of the world that way as well as a consequence. Sorry, Ocean Baby, could you remind me what your previous point was? It'll help me get back on track. I've got ADHD, I apologize.
Yeah. No, I said that even within humans, the differentiation between what is natural and what is not natural is not like a definitive, as something you can claim in a definitive way, because humans in themselves are natural beings, even if we oftentimes want to forget that. And I think
Absolutely.
that also can be a point made that the differentiation between we have the natural world and we have the human world, which is in some way not natural, helps, of course, in facilitating or in legitimizing the human exploitation of nature, because see ourselves not as part of the system, but standing above it.
Yes, absolutely.
So what
Yeah, that is. I'd think that's part of it. Where if you think of that Mannerist movement, they're looking at themselves as well as a part of nature, as a product of nature,
so one
not separate from it, like a false, like kind of trying to break with a false dichotomy.
Yeah.
I agree completely. Yeah.
and something about
So you want to say, Brett?
yeah well Jay just gave me another idea too. Is I know it's fleeting, it's going away. Okay, whatever, forget that idea. So I guess something that we could say so
False dichotomy.
well so yeah, okay, yeah, you just re-triggered it. False dichotomy. So like if we looked at those buildings too, there's a lot of like excessiveness to those buildings that you could think of as emulating nature, where nature is often excessive. It gives you more than you need to survive, assuming we treat everything properly. But another way that we, huh?
Oh, sorry, all I was going to say is this is the thing. We've always lived in abundance.
Yeah.
The myth of like overpopulation and the myth of like, actually, no, there's a finite resource. We've always lived in abundance. We've never known it. We just thought we needed to convert everything to factories.
Yeah.
The moment that we put that at the beginning of the cycle was the moment that we started limiting our idea of abundance. It's terrible. It's a black hole. I'll let you digress.
Yeah. And there's an interesting thing with the factories too. Ford tried to build a factory in some place, or it was like a factory city, like Ford City, and it completely failed because he tried to do it with a nomadic group of people that just left when it was time to leave. But going back to mannerism, we could say that mannerism makes the natural unnatural, where the High Renaissance tried to make the unnatural natural. So for the High Renaissance, you had a lot of, as we discussed before, you had a lot of balance and harmony, and you had also a lot of like divine or mythical subjects that were just treated as a given. But in Mannerism, you sort of have the opposite of that, where you have vegetables take on. I'm forgetting the word for this. Is it that you anthropomorphize
Anthropomorphize,
vegetables?
yeah.
Yeah, you're anthropomorphizing vegetables or sea life or buildings, and so you're making you're blurring the lines. What was previously thought unnatural, you're making it, or you're taking the natural and making it unnatural.
John Lennon in Lime Station, or Lime Street Station, rather.
Yeah.
Maybe I don't
There's
listen to the Beatles.
There's actually a really interesting throughput here. Actually, I hadn't considered it before now until you just brought it up. But usually, maybe this speaks to a kind of British sensibility inside of me. So I apologize if that's the case. But we love to cut down. We love to, like, if a motherfucker sticks out, like, guillotine, right? It's kind of implicit. And for example, if it's like when somebody, I think I was speaking to Jack earlier about this. We have this kind of ugly knee-jerk tendency sometimes when like an adolescent is trying to find themselves and they're trying to figure out who they are in a world of like mass production, and they're trying to like string together an identity and be unique. Everyone always fucking dogpiles on people who try to be too unique.
Yeah, grow up.
You know what I mean?
I think it's a Western thing in general, frankly, because it kind of happens in the United States too, although it's a bit less pronounced because of the whole sort of like screw you, my own freedoms thing we have going on as like a counter pressure.
But you still see it, right? Like if a kid acts too much, like a lot of times you'll hear adults go, "Oh, you need to grow up," but what they really mean is you need to conform.
Yeah, you're being a bit too
It's still
neurodivergent right now.
within a certain. It's still within a certain acceptable framework,
Yeah.
and people can't see beyond that framework or move beyond it.
Mm-hmm.
You guys should have heard the comments when I was saying to somebody that I'm like doing an online reading group about philosophy.
Oh, what did they say?
Yeah.
What were the comments?
Yeah, well, like in some way it's the same. It's so like it's not too that I like should grow up in a sense. But people definitely don't see this as somebody that a young person would do in yeah.
And part maybe going back a little bit, and I think it relates to what was just said, but going back a little bit, part of that making the natural unnatural in mannerism is also what makes that aesthetic unsettling to outside viewers.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
This is an adjacent point, but Matty said, and yeah, contemporary society is obsessed with time waste. Oh my fucking god, is that true? Right? We have built entire systems around just-in-time philosophy, right? Like genuinely, even like there's obviously the whole argument about there's the kind of rabbit, you took the words right out of my mouth. Yeah, the capitalist realism argument where it's like, oh, it's not productive, why are you doing it? There's that whole kettle of worms, right, which we can already denigrate and push to the side. But there's also the this idea of like, again, I brought this up earlier. I had some I chucked out some bagels yesterday. What is the date today? We are like the 16th of June. I chucked out some bagels yesterday because the date on them was the 31st of May. I was like, oh well, I can't eat these, right? I gotta chuck these. So they're about 2 weeks out of date. I was thinking, wait, why do we do perishable? I was just like stood there for 10 to 15 minutes just thinking about perishable goods, right? Like a normal person would. I just thinking about like bread and milk and like all this shit I would go to supermarkets for. And I was like, what is the point of me ever planning the future if I can get immediate gratification and just go to the shops when I want to and get something immediately now and get my sandwich now and all this stuff, right? And it's like there's tension there. We're like constantly asked to be hi. We're constantly asked to be like responsible, but also responsive. It's a do like there is no right way to be. There is literally no right way to be today. Like, sorry, I lost my train of thought a little bit. No. There's no like governing philosophy telling you how to navigate the world. You're kind of like left to your own devices, essentially. Just seeing what shit sticks. And I think the one of the defining features of like the modern world as it is at the moment is that the most effective forms of control in society have understood that they understood the things they can't control and are just controlling everything else, right? So it's like, for example, like the freedoms given to you through having a passport, or the freedoms given to you by having a car, the freedoms given to you by using a road, right? Sure, you're free to, drive your car that is registered. You're free to like drive your registered car down a highway that is monitored. You're free to drive past the speed cameras. You're free to go through border security at checkpoints at like an airport. Like these are all freedoms, right?
But there
that's
was an
gonna be-
imposition that had to happen in the first place to make those truly be freedoms, for one thing.
Would you mind expanding on that?
Well, for example, the idea of having freedom through a passport is predicated on the imposition of borders. The freedom to travel on a highway is predicated on the imposition of automotive infrastructure. See also the freedom to be able to drive anywhere in your car. That's still predicated on having other not fully predicated, but usually predicated on not having access to other modes of transportation.
Yeah,
I
true.
For it
love
being
that
a true freedom.
And also, your passport doesn't belong to you, and the state can take it off you if they will so desire.
Yeah.
Absolutely, yeah. All they need to do is press a couple of buttons on a terminal somewhere, and your passport becomes useless.
Oh, do you guys want to know like a fucked up little story? The government changed my name, like 6 months ago.
Why? What?
So okay, story time, right? So my oh, this is being recorded, isn't it?
Oh yeah, it is. Yep, it's So
Okay, well, you'll edit. It's fine. It's fine. I trust you.
I trim the beginning and the end if there's stuff. I don't really edit the middle parts. I try to be very careful with not having people's names show up. So,
Okay.
but
This is why I haven't used my real name once.
Fucking
yeah, no self-doxing here.
Big black mark on this bit, please. Okay, I trust you.
Wait, what?
So,
Cut out this bit. I'm gonna have to.
Cut out this bit. Yeah, basically.
I'm gonna have to scroll through 3 hours of video.
Stop the recording, then, baby. Stop it.
I guess I could.
Stop it.
Right?
We'll get back to it. Okay.
Should I? Oh, can I just pause the recording? Oh, there we go.
Yeah.
We are recording again.
All right. And are we ready to pick back up with the reading?
I'm so down. It's
cool.
we're at stake is the unity of the arts. I think.
I had already done that paragraph and was getting ready to do crucially for.
Yes, you did.
Yes.
My bad.
Crucially, for Deleuze and Guattari, this sequence in thinking about the unity of arts is neither part of history nor a post-historical conjecture. Rather, it is a matter of discerning tendencies. Everything we attribute to an age was already present in the preceding age, even if it had already been obscured by different perceptual conditions. Just as early modern physics is based on a vitalist materialism, Mannerist art already replaced the organic regime of form and content with a life proper to matter, a vital state of matter as such, a material vitalism that doubtless exists everywhere but is ordinarily hidden or covered, rendered unrecognizable, dissociated by the hylomorphic model. Paul Cézanne discovered in Tintoretto, why am I having problems with that word of all words? A cosmic obsession with impersonal forces, a blend of the supra-terrestrial within the terrestrial that is not given in perception, but it is itself a perception. As with El Greco, earth and sky collide and combine in an electric sensation that precedes any symbolic or figurative code. In molecularizing perception, similarly, Arcimboldo manages to capture the infinite in the finite without any notion of transcendent design, whether theological or humanist. These forces / sensations / infinities are cosmic in the sense that they constitute pure beings of this. I'm going to finish off like a paragraph there. Pure beings of the sensible. If they are usually hidden, this is because they reveal sensation to be durational, not spatial or historical. They are a bit of time in its purest state. The image is a little ritornello. I don't know what that actually means. The image is not an object, but a process.
Ritornello, that's a word that comes directly from Guattari, Felix Guattari. So,
okay, I haven't read him, so that explains why I'm not familiar. Please elucidate the class.
I'll try my best. It's been a while since I've engaged with the idea, but the ritornello, it's coming from A Thousand Plateaus, the chapter on it's not the rhythm, but it's where they talk about
motif, right?
Sorry, what did you say?
It's like a musical motif, right?
Yeah, it's a musical motif, but I think it's it's the chapter on the refrain. So like the refrain is basically like this like repeated like musical element that kind of just like pulsates in a sense, but it's not only in music, and you can they basically apply it to basically everything. But like it's a very organic concept. So like one of the examples they give is like how like a bird will like sing, and then by singing it marks its it marks the edges of its own territory by singing, right?
Yeah.
And it's just that like I don't know if you've seen the heard of the cheeseburger bird, but it's like cheeseburger, cheeseburger, and it makes that sound. And like whatever bird sound we're going with, that's just a funny example. But like it's what Deleuze and Guattari are saying there is it's quite literally creating a zone of space, and it's marking its territory in that way. I think Ritornello is kind of doing something similar there. I don't remember the exact usage of the word, but that's where it's coming from, is that chapter.
It is a musical
it's-
term
sure.
too, outside of Deleuze and Guattari. It references like a short instrumental refrain, like you said, a refrain, or an interlude in vocal work, and the origin comes from an Italian, from a diminutive of ritorno, or return.
Yeah.
And there might be
You want to
some
hear the
deeper
really
connection
sick
there.
thing? I've just read it. The ritornello as a recurring tutti passage can be traced back to the music of 16th century Venetian composer Giovanni Gabrieli.
Oh,
So it's also around that
era.
that same
majorly
era.
discussed
It's
period
the
that's
Baroque.
happening. Okay.
Yeah. I like the idea of refrain as well, because refrain is like little return,
Yeah.
right? And I love the idea of refrain as the term for it, because it's like, let's just sparkle in a little bit of what we've introduced you to, and that's enough to let you know you're home. And it's kind of
The
how
theme of
Platform does
repetition
work.
keeps coming up in the work as a whole, and I imagine it's building on that here.
Yeah. Well, it is a little return. So like with the bird example, that also applies, but also think of like a protest chant. That's a ritornello as well. So like there's that like so
Call
there
and
was
response format.
Yeah, call and response. And like I remember like recently whenever the student protests were happening for like Palestine, the students were saying like they were kind of having that call and response thing. And yeah, but it constantly returns to the same thing, like the first lyric, and then they'll chant maybe a different thing, but they keep coming back to the same place. But it's not just that for one, they're creating a sonic like territory, but they're also kind of building off what you said already, like they're creating a little home at that point, right? Like it's kind of bringing you back to somewhere. You could also, another example could even be like chant like the work chants during slavery too would be like little ritornellos.
Chain gang songs.
Exactly. That's
sea shanties.
Sea shanties too, for sure. Well, sea shanties are perfect too, because like you're not, you're in movement. Like you're literally not in the same place while you're singing it. You're in constant movement the entire time.
This is starting.
That's the processual part, right? It's a really good example.
Yeah, I mean, ritornellos also alternate between contrasting materials, right? Which goes back to something Jay was saying about how mannerism graphs. I'm not sure if he said like different contexts or times, but there's sort of this grafting over each other that happens in mannerism.
we were talking about how every kind of period of art or perspective space. It's like a kind of false linear evolution where they think that their idea of space is the final form of space. And we see that in architecture, like people like Siegfried Gideon, but it's kind of not, there's like an uncomfortable sewing together of two conceptions of time and space
So it totally disrupts like any
going
sort
on.
of static composition when it does that, right? And also with the ritornello, you have I mean, there's like an interaction between, like, to go back to the protest example, between the people doing the initial chant and then the other people responding. And in this Mannerist art, it seems that there is like a fluid interaction between the viewer and the art as well. So the artwork sort of evolves over time instead of remaining stagnant.
You could say the image is not an object, but a process.
Yes. And yes, like the ritornello, which is a constant reinterpretation and transformation. Also, I guess, depending on where you are, as someone was saying. To tie it back to that.
It made me think of the word delimiting. Like where, like a bird delimits its territory with its call.
I think they actually might use those words exactly. I can't remember, but that sounds like almost exactly what they say.
Absolutely. I think sometimes with refrains and returns, it's good to not pathologize it as such, but like to map the territory of return, because otherwise what we end up inadvertently doing is leaving Hegel and Nietzsche open to fascists, right? Where they have this idea of like, oh, eternal return. Think about what they took from you, kind of type beat, right?
Return with a Roman V instead of a U.
Yeah, that kind of shit, right? Which is like nonsensical, and as we spoke about earlier, or I brought it up earlier, and it's like in an earlier channel, if you want to look at it, there's a Huey Newton quote where he talks about how actually, if you think about it, it's kind of impossible to return to previous conditions of existence, because the idea of colonization is to extract the resources from, transport it to the imperialist home, and then at that point you can't return to a demarcated space because that space has been spoiled. There isn't really any colony under empire, especially a global empire, right? Where you can't just return to your previous conditions of existence. So in that Hegelian sense, there's no return, right? There's only synthesis. There's only big fish eating little fish, as Mal put it, right?
It is not possible to return because the material conditions are no longer the same. It's not physically possible.
So the thing that these like alt-right types lean towards is like an impossible ideal. So that's kind of the thing you need to fight against. But it's not fighting against return in general, right? We shouldn't be out to close the door on history, right? There's a lot of things we are turning our eyes away from or averting our gaze from that really deserve more attention.
Much like crafty folks walking through a scrapyard and going, ooh, I can make a thing out of this, and a thing out of this, and a thing out of this, and a thing out of this. We should be looking at history in the same sort of way, I guess. Would be the core takeaway there.
Completely.
Taking the bits that are reusable and leaving behind the bits that clearly failed.
That's a Maoist. Develop the good and throw away the bad. But yeah, it's kind of interesting. Ritornello's all about emphasizing repetition and, change and that sort of dynamic interaction. And yeah, you can totally see how that relates to Mannerist art, where the viewer is constantly engaging with and reinterpreting the Mannerist art. You look at Vertumnus, you might have one interpretation of it. I'm forgetting my original interpretation. Vegetal life. That vegetables have a life of their own, right? But then I was looking at it again later, and I was like, it could also be you are what you eat. And I don't know what the third takeaway is going to be, but yeah, there's always, it always opens itself up to that constant reinterpretation and dynamic interaction.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Would if there's no other thoughts, would anybody else like to continue reading?
Yeah, I can pick back up again. I was just letting the conversation continue there.
No worries.
Deleuze and Guattari claim that the eternal object of art is to make a monument for sensation, a hallucinatory memory, as it were, not of a past present mediated by the flow of time, but of a past that has never been present, but that nonetheless retains a potential for the present's becoming. Or, put differently, to produce an aesthetic fact is to construct a possible world from the chaotic interstices between a material and the deterritorializing forces to which it is exposed. Whereas for art history, art is always a thing of the past. They follow Bergson in taking the entire past as coexisting virtually with each moment of the passing present as the condition of the new. Art itself is a mode of figuring the past differently, of encounters and experiments with the depth of duration, the passeur de durée.
Oh, very good.
I took a single semester of French. Please do not give me too much credit.
Okay, it was pretty good. It was better than me.
I just want to quickly point out that this is quite literally what Jack put in the chat like maybe 10 minutes ago. So, like, yeah, kudos to Jack because he made that exact connection to Bergson.
Where is
Not
that?
Points for man. Sorry, again with the gender. Anyways.
I think Jack uses he, him pronouns, so that's not incorrect.
Okay. I've developed a bad habit of using man as like a generic replacement for people I don't know the name of or can't bring the name of to hand immediately.
All right, I've adopted the Devonian, like, are you right, me lover? Kind of type me.
There is something there with the eternal object of art is to make a monument for sensation. I don't know why, but it totally just made me think of that super tall ass building because there is something extremely sensational about it.
That one's like a monument to spectacle, kind of.
Yeah, and monumental. There's something real monumental.
Well, it's kind of Hegel's idea of art there, where the art is something that you consume, and it must have a sensuous nature. And I think that's a romantic idea, and we still live with an element of that in our conception of art today.
That might be the third interpretation of Vertumnus. Something with
maybe. Maybe you save the third interpretation for the third reading.
Huh?
Maybe you save the third interpretation for the third reading.
Facts. There we go.
You get one interpretation per week.
Hell yeah.
Jack, was there something you were gonna say? I saw you unmute yourself for a second.
Just gonna say it's cool, but yeah, this is just straight Bergsonism. So much of this is exactly what Deleuze said, and that all over there. But just remember, that's where the cool inverted cone comes from, is the theory of the virtual, and we must actualize the virtual rather than realize the possible.
Well, and I think that is what
How do
connects
you
to, like,
Bergson's idea of time, where something, the durée, where something new has to be able to appear. How do you square that with this?
That's what is funny is he says something about the possible here, but again, earlier I heard an idea of accruing of successive things, and again, that's the virtual. It coexists in the present, and it's like the slow accruing, and that is literally what makes everything new at each moment in that sense. So I keep getting a bunch of senses of that, but again, not 100%.
Oh, the mannerism certainly has this a pile of accumulating things.
By virtual,
it's like
you don't
inverted cone.
By virtual, you don't mean online, do you?
no.
No. Virtual in the Bergsonian sense, baby.
I don't know what that
It's the
means.
memory memory cannot be reduced to the physical. It has to eclipse. So Bergson makes this argument that the brain, there's no way that all of memory collapses, physically reducible to the brain in localizable areas. And what that means is essentially this vertical inverted cone kind of extends out, and you can literally live life at varying heights. So you can be at the most, lowest part where you're so close to sensation, but on the opposite side of that, you can live life very, high up in a sense where you're like way in your thoughts, way in your memories kind of deal. And
Deeply
you're just way away from the moment.
transcendental.
Yeah. And all that in a sense though it's funny because it's kind of imminent. It's like imminent to each organism. But in that, a zone of indetermination gets created. And that's where, again, all the art possibilities have to come from that kind of inverted cone in that sense. But that inverted cone is the virtual.
Yeah. And the hard thing is you have to oppose, like what Jack said, you're opposing the virtual to the actual, not the real with the possible. Because like previous like philosophy is constantly opposing the real and the possible. So like in Kant, it like we have to understand like the foundations of all possible, or the conditions of all possible experience, right? And like what is real, it can be deduced from what is possible, but like the virtual is something that's a lot more chaotic and not necessarily real. Like it doesn't actually have to like exist. It's like almost a pre-individual singularity or something. Like, but prior to it actually existing, it's like it's almost prior to possibility. I don't know if that's the best way to put it, but it's like a place where things get mixed and can kind of emerge, I guess.
By the real, do you mean
I'm getting
like,
imagining utopia.
Sure.
Oh yeah.
by
Yeah,
the,
Like
by the real, do you mean like a permanent, eternal, and unchanging thing in existence?
Yeah, like reality, right?
For sure.
Yeah, so I think that's a good way to put it.
I have to go now, guys. So see you next week.
Bye, Ocean.
No worries.
nice one, Ocean.
Have a good one. Nice to meet you.
Yeah.
Great discussion, man.
In the simplest sense, though, in the actual reality, in that sense, it's very shallow. The only way to add depth to experience is the virtual, and it's like limited in that sense. Like, but there's so many virtual possibilities. But again, that's the key: is to really distinguish the virtual. Bergson and Deleuze accentuates this. The theory of the virtual is to replace the concept of the possible. This is to get genetic condition, like an actual casus kind of new novelty thing, but I think it's kind of mystic at that point.
Well, because that's what can actually be creative. Because if we're stuck within possible experience, then we're just left with Kant, right? It's like, well, everything is already predetermined by the faculties, and like everything that you perceive in sensation was already like delimited by like just basically your mind, right? And you can't escape that. You can't see, observe, or experience things in themselves, and you're completely stuck within the realm of the possible. So that's why I think Deleuze, being like a a lover of novelty wants to get away from that kind of notion where we're just kind of stuck, and we're and the same thing with Bergson, like, is that you can't really have emergent phenomena in that way because everything is already determined in advance.
Yeah.
Necessity of utopia.
We kind of get stuck in this Platonic theory of forms, like all the ingredients must predate us and also be holier than thou. Otherwise, we wouldn't get these concrete forms that we come to understand. But obviously, you kind of come to understand it's a bit bullshit, right? I did just want to ask Spencer. I saw you unmuted yourself. Is there something you wanted to say?
If you are speaking,
Hello?
we cannot hear you.
Yeah.
The next paragraph looks so good.
Yep. Can hear now.
I saw the unmute, but I can't hear the voice, the beautiful voice.
I think they're in the mountains, so maybe they just have bad service.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay.
Technology, am I right?
Isn't it wonderful?
So, so the actual is like basically what's currently happening, right? Like we can kind of these are simpler, and then the possible is just like what could happen.
It's the conditions of possibility, I would say. So
Okay.
it's like it's what's necessary for something to happen.
Okay.
Like so, like the conditions of possibility, right? Basically, like what Kant says is like, in order for us to be able to sense something, we need to have conditions of sensation, and so like we wouldn't even be. That's what separates us from like rocks, right? Like rocks don't have a condition for sensibility. Like they can be broken apart and they don't feel pain. They don't like sense it coming. They can't anticipate like being crushed, right? But we can. Like, and we and that's because there are like conditions that we have latent within us.
Could the possible even be stuff that doesn't currently exist or function? Like could they be imagined possibilities? Like could the possible be if you think of the conditions where a rock would feel sensations? Or
I mean, yeah, absolutely.
The best way to think about it is Kierkegaard or something.
Is what?
Oh, sorry, Spencer. It's Kierkegaard. Spencer, you go. Sorry.
Yeah, so with the rock example, we can imagine a possible, possible conditions where a rock could sense it's being broken apart, but that possibility is not within the rock's virtuosity, in the sense that in virtue of how the rock actually is, it's not possible for it to have any sort of feeling of being broken apart.
There's no content to the possibility.
Yeah.
Or form.
And then it kind
because it's the form that's the possibility. Does that make sense? So the content is what actualizes the possibility.
The form is the possibility, but the essence is the actual. So it kind of goes to Mao's why can't a rock be an egg or something like that? Like why can't a rock give birth to a chicken or something? Because its relational essence just won't allow it to do that.
I get where you're coming from.
In virtue of what the rock is, it can't be an egg.
Yeah.
I think what's really cool as well is the throughput here to architecture, but architecture actualizes the actual, right? That's why it's so important that there's this throughput on all this relation between mannerism and architecture specifically, because mannerism is an art form, but as an art form, it has like heavy hands in the pockets of architecture, and architecture is the organization of the living spaces of the living. And because it's a material thing that we can point towards, we can then discuss. And that's why I think it's important to discuss some of these mannerist architectures that have cropped up. Because actually, when there's something that is actualized, it's then material, and when it's material, you can then discuss it. When it's simply actual, it's hard to discuss a lot of the time.
Yeah, definitely.
And in another sense, it's if Mannerist architecture is simply possible and then realized, then there's almost no significance to it, the fact that it was realized, because it was just like one possibility that was realized among a whole sea of possibilities. Whereas if we think in terms of virtuality and actuality, it is significant that this possibility is within the virtuosity of what can actually take place, such that it's expressing something of our actual conditions of like our actual lives, not just our possible lives, and not just our real lives in a basic object sense.
Yeah. I think there's a really interesting contrast here with how we live our lives as bodies that only go through one future. In the sense that the next day never has to happen, and whatever happens to you is the only possibility that could have ever happened to you, if that makes sense, right? It can get a bit fucky-wucky when we try and discuss this, but obviously the world is open to you, but you can only ever go down the one path. Our bodies, in a sense, are kind of like this, where we can only really consider the one route, even though all these roads are open.
Yearning for the virtual, but forced into the actual.
Something like that.
I almost want to inverse it a little bit too, to say that maybe Mannerism expresses a sea of possibilities in one possibility, rather than one possibility in a sea of possibilities, and that the former is actually the more natural way that existence happens. So you can take a single scene in Mannerism or a single subject and you imbue it with multiple layers of all this complexity and ambiguity and meaning. Like,
we've been doing Mannerism to this Mannerism text, one paragraph at a time, the entire time.
I know. And we haven't gotten 2 pages. but there's a lot of rich stuff. Yeah, there's a lot of rich stuff in there. But going back to Joby's thing of where, you know, the next day you have the actual that actually happens, but there was an infinite amount of possibilities of what I guess could have I need to flush out this idea a little more. But
Shall I keep reading in that spirit?
I'm down.
Well, real quick, yeah. We can also think of the real possibility that's actually been realized in how our life is in this moment as in a Mannerist way as a sea of possibilities that can't just be reduced down to one possibility. And maybe even like the defining problem of thinking in terms of possible versus real, as opposed to thinking in terms of actual versus virtual, is that if we think in terms of possibilities, then there's a tendency to want to reduce possibilities down to single possibilities, such that like a building needs to be just a single possibility out of the sea of possible buildings that could be constructed. When actually this building is full of possibilities. The building itself is many possibilities.
Which gets at that natural complexity of humanity and human perception and human experience and human interpretation. Like, if going back to Joby's example, let's say the next day, I don't know, there's some sort of narrative, right? And there's that one singular narrative, but everybody reading that one singular narrative is going to experience it differently and have slightly different interpretations of it, which can kind of tie back to that infinite possibility in a single actuality.
Yeah. I'm with you.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, we cooking the gas now.
I'm sorry, little man. My leg was killing me. I need you to move, kitty.
No worries.
I had a cat in my lap, and he made it so I had to have my leg crooked weird. It was making my ankle start to hurt.
Oh, for sure. Should we
Would,
go to this next paragraph though? Like, one of
Yeah.
the.
Ready when y'all are.
It'd be cool if we could crank out this introduction. Yeah.
Looking back, a more adequate model for creativity than the classical or romantic artist genius who belongs only to art's official and exclusive history is therefore the artist alchemist as cosmic operator, not so much of the past, but of pastness, who destabilizes and re-dramatizes the very relation between art, history, and life. The challenge of composition is neither that of God's creation nor that of a romanticized nature, but that of geoengineering, bioart, and living currencies, all of which open up the experience of strangeness or untimeliness, as opposed to the timeless, that remains entirely immanent to material construction, but without coinciding with it. From matter to manner, art makes matter ascend into a spiritual domain of sensations where in quotes for whatever reason, as Deleuze and Guattari wrote, it's because it's part of a quote, all disparate and heterogeneous elements are convoked.
I have to cut in with one thing here. Leonardo da Vinci's last words were, "I have offended God and mankind. My work did not reach the quality it should have."
And his is all about making the divine natural, right?
That just struck me with that classic when he talks about the classic romantic artist genius who belongs only to art's official and exclusive history.
Damn.
I'm happy
I have
to keep
offended
going.
God and mankind.
Man, talk about unfinished business.
My guy cancelled himself on his deathbed.
Take that, liberals. Try cancel me now.
Let's see who cancels who.
Let's see.
The ultimate, like, fucking... That's, like, the best sample to put for a drop, man.
I mean, if you're...
Chad da Vinci.
God damn it, now I'm picturing Da Vinci just mogging on everybody.
Because you
pointing at his jaw, bye-bye.
Da Vinci's like painting human perfection and stuff like that, right? A lot of times.
And he's like, these hands are garbage. I can't produce sufficient quality work. I insult God with my efforts.
Well, the thing is...
Chad Icarus versus the Virgin Sun.
Well, the thing is, humans aren't perfect, so it would be like you're bastardizing humanity by painting them as like perfect or ideal and stuff.
All right, I gotta tag somebody else in for the next paragraph I'm reading.
He was a failed mannerist.
He was a failed mannerist. Hell yeah.
What's interesting is we still use the Vitruvian Man
because he was
trying
he kind of presupposes it. He was trying to get to that point.
Oh, yeah, with the Vitruvian Man.
He fully exhausted all the means of his time.
Joby, what were you saying on the Vitruvian Man?
In that Marxist sense.
Yeah, yeah.
I'm sorry, I just mentioned how we still use the Vitruvian Man today as like a reference point towards, like, in the same sense that neoliberalism borrows heavily from the Renaissance, right? And rationalism still, like, has a strong foothold. We still refer to the Vitruvian Man in the sense that we still have, like, sexism, right? I don't know if this is too much of a reach, but if we think of, like, the start of our modern thought as starting with Renaissance thought, then at the start of it all, there is he, the classical being, the perfect man, right? And this is where we draw our referential points for what constitutes the human, right? because as we know, we have this conception of human rights and so on. It's like a very permeate, deep-seated sort of conviction that the globe holds, that we should uphold these standards of living for all creatures. And yet, all the time, we still farm other mammals for their flesh. We still denigrate other people. Like in the EU, for example, you just need to look towards the EU and see their policies on immigration and see like how many bodies need to drown in the ocean before action takes place, right? Like, I'm not being facetious here. Like, some people don't qualify as human. Some people have never qualified as human. And this is something that humanism can't see because it likes to tout itself as a universal when it's very, very particular. Like, not everyone is human. And this is exactly what humanism teaches us. A bit of a mouthful, but I won't divulge. I'd like to read more.
You know,
Jay, would you like to continue reading? Or would anybody else like to
I
continue
would love
reading?
to.
Yeah.
Continental modal metaphysics. Yet while it shares their methodological premises, my aim here is not a commentary on Deleuze and Guattari. Elsewhere, I have put forward a reconstruction of their take on Mannerism, as well as an account of their contributions to art history. Here the task is to develop their point of view further toward what could be called a continental modal metaphysics. Perhaps it should be said that this book paints a group portrait in neo-Mannerist philosophy. It does not summarize or inventories, it redistributes and multiplies. Combining early modern philosophers such as Bruno and Leibniz with modern philosophers such as Henri Bergson, William James, Alfred North Whitehead, John Dewey, Etienne Sorial, and Gilbert Simondon, the aim is to distill from them a concept with enough historical and systematic depth for expressing the signature of Mannerist practices in art, philosophy, and beyond. For just as from its inception, the question of Mannerism's historical existence has been a constituent problem for the history of style, there is a way of thinking and acting that one can call properly Mannerist. Bergsonist philosopher Vladimir Yankelevich opens his trilogy Le je ne sais quoi et le prescyrien 1980 with an opposition of modal to substantialist philosophy. Personified by the Mannerist poet Balthazar Gracian, who argued that manner constitutes a second being. Modal philosophy means that all is an effect of style, that there is nothing beyond appearances, and that being is practically what it resembles. This notion that appearances are not less than being, but otherwise than being, takes the form of a rehabilitation of the accident from its Aristotelian subordination to substance and the ensuing dialectic of essence and existence. Whatever exists, exists because there is change. Identity, as expressed in subject-predicate logic, is only the mode in which a being has being in becoming. But there is no additional underlying reality to explain its continuity over time. Rather, there is appearance creating its own being and thereby its own possibility. For in itself, a mode is nothing but what will be. It is pure advent. As with charm or grace, Yankelevich argues, the mode of making something is both less and infinitely more than the thing made. It is at once the prescription that is merely qualitative addition to a being, like a second nature, and the je ne sais quoi that constitutes the individuality of beings, their intrinsic pneuma or magnetic pole. Passing between being and becoming, modality is the potential, quad, by which a thing, quid, becomes what it is, by which it is differentiated from abstract flux, and by which it continues to communicate with other things in a metastable state. The fact is nothing without the making, just as the making is nothing without the manner of making, and equally the determined manners of indeterminate being are nothing without the great determining manner of all these manners. And finally, the being of manners is nothing without the great manner of being, which goes by the name of becoming. There are things that exist, the ways in which they are produced, the generic being of those ways, and the way of this being, which is pure becoming. In modal philosophy, being and becoming are formally distinct, but not really. There is an ongoing spiraling between them, but neither is foundational for or opposed to the other. Rather, as Simondon writes, becoming is an immanent, non-dialectical dimension of being corresponding to its capacity to dephase and overflow itself. Being in general has no unity of identity, but becomes as the being that it is, by way of a cascade of modes or thresholds of individuation. It exists because it has a manner of coming about, yet manners are real only insofar as they inhere in individual existence, which is to say that while manners have no actuality in themselves, they subsist and insist virtually as relative unities and real continuities in the material processes in which things come about.
Very interesting. I got one point, if I've got the luxury of making it.
Go on.
Something earlier was mentioned. I think it was Balthazar Gratian who argued about there being nothing behind appearances, which echoes the idea that with the advent of mass media and the advent of the camera essentially being able to capture reality, but in capturing can only produce a representation of reality. But that representation of reality, if that's the only thing you can access if you're not there on the field, becomes a substitute for reality and therefore more real than what we might denigrate as the real. And so in this sense, there's a sort of cognitive dissonance that happens where, have you noticed with, say, a fictional TV series, you have a comfortable distance to it where you realize, okay, all these people are actors and they're playing characters and the story's not real, even though it's inviting you to believe it's realistic, like Breaking Bad, for example, right? Breaking Bad, I know you've written about this, Matty. It's not necessitated on the fact that it's a real story with real truths, but it's still nestled in reality somewhere, where it's like, you can understand that, like, with the mechanisms of how, like, healthcare work in the United States, you could see how somebody might get to this point of, like, you know, synthesizing drugs and it kind of escalating to this sort of fictional ideal, right? But there's also a difference between Breaking Bad and, say, a documentary. where a documentary attempts to give you an unmediated picture of the real. But how do you get an unmediated piece of media? You can't really, right? So there's a bit of dissonance that happens there with the documentary that attempts to be more real than reality. They're giving you an unmediated picture, but in doing so, it brushes up against the indolences of the medium. And so we kind of get this weird vortex that happens where we can't establish whether what we're seeing is really real or really not that real. And so, Baudrillard would kind of go ahead and say, there is no picture of the real which does not attempt to modify its own perception of itself. Or in other words, there is no possibility for representation anymore. We cannot represent any longer. And so I like to, that's got something to do with what Balthazar is speaking about, where there's no form behind appearance, actually. The appearance is actually all there is. The rehabilitation of the accident is an incredible concept.
There's something interesting there with photos being more real too. I forget the photographer. He was really racist, but he dealt with daguerreotypes, which are like a really incredible photography format. You get a lot more detail than like even modern cameras. And he had this racist idea to go and take photos of black people. I'm not quite sure how to describe it, but like you might get like a black farmer or something and just a close-up shot of him, right? And his idea was if he could send these around, he can prove that black people are subhuman, right? So he did that, but it actually had the opposite effect, because people saw the humanity in black people in these photos, and his plan completely backfired. And I think
I was even thinking about Jack earlier sent a photo of their kitty, and I was like, you know what? Like if there was a cat in the room right now, I might ignore them. But this photo is so like luscious and like close up. I struggle to ignore this.
Yeah, and you could imagine that there was probably a lot of white people that knew black people and were super racist, and for whatever reason, maybe the aspect of photos being more real, or maybe instead of saying more real, but like overly real, they changed their minds when they saw these photos going around.
This is probably beyond the scope of conversation for the moment. I wish Kat was actually here because he would share some good thoughts on this. But there's like a very huge sexual tension with cinema, even when the content itself could be anything, right? Because you are kind of in a very prone position, forced to watch these like larger than life characters on an extremely blown up screen, right?
Yeah.
And so there's a sort of tension between bodies there, which is interesting to consider.
Yeah, and there probably wouldn't have been sexual tension in these photos, but there definitely is like intimacy in these photos, especially the detail that comes out in a daguerreotype. You know, you see the pain and suffering basically in these people.
Yeah.
Having them represented in such a way makes it so much easier to connect yourself to them, because instead of it being like a painting, for example, where you can dismiss the romanticization of the artist, for example, In the case of a photograph, there isn't necessarily that capacity to be able to dismiss it because you kind of have
Yeah.
you have to look at the camera and go, well, the machine doesn't have bias.
Yeah, yeah.
It's a double-edged sword, right? Because I agree with what you said exactly. And at the same time, there is still a delimiter in between. Yeah, there's still a mediation, right?
Yeah, that
The
photographer had
still
bias.
decides where to point the camera.
That photographer had bias. He was trying to prove he was trying to prove to people that black people were inferior. Instead, he ended up proving the opposite to everyone, that black people are just as human as everyone else. So it's kind of interesting. Even with that bias, there was sort of like an over real in those photos coming about.
There's an excess.
Yeah.
I think you kind of see that when it's a bit of a trope, but it's maybe I shouldn't call it a trope because it's like something that actually happens way more than doesn't. But the idea of like the soldier who gets like a photo of their loved one or something, right? And it's the only connection they have to them when they're far apart. And there's like an excess to that photo, right? It's not just any photo. It's not just like a little picture. There's like a real excess there.
Yeah. Should we continue reading?
More than happy to.
There is 10 pages till the end of this introduction, but
we can blast through it.
It has probably been 2 hours. Should each of us read like 5 pages, and at the end of each 5 pages, discuss something for a little?
5 paragraphs or 5 pages?
5 pages. I don't know. 5 paragraphs.
Do you want to just stop on page 16 and call it a night after that?
I'm down. I'm down for that.
Where's 16?
There's like 3 more
16
pages, I think.
Yeah, that's
Isn't it? Where are we now?
We're on page 12, so we would read to like page 15, and then 16 is a new sub chapter.
And then next week we start on that manner and matter, but we've just finished these last 3 pages now.
I'm down.
Oh, that would be good.
I prefer that.
I think that'd be
good. Sounds about right. I could always read if you guys would like me to. Unless anybody else would like
Let's read a page each or a bit each.
Heck yeah.
And just I like that idea.
Yeah. Go on.
Okie dokie. Okay, I guess I'll kick us off then if you guys want.
Down.
Are we on the paragraph starting with the concept?
Mm-hmm. I believe so.
Okie dokie. Just go down to where it says contemporary analytical.
Yeah.
With the concept of modal philosophy in hand, it is possible to identify key moments in 20th century philosophy that are more or less Mannerist. The later Wittgenstein was able to define language as a form of life, thus making meaning entirely conditional on its fluctuating manners of use and doing away with all the external criteria. For Heidegger, the being of the phenomenon is defined by the way in which it reveals itself. For example, the thing of things, just as existentials such as in der Weltsein and Mietsein are the factisch possibilities or guises, Weisen, of an otherwise propertyless being there, Dasein. In phenomenology, experience is not subjective qualification of real quantifiable objects in nature. Rather, nature, things, relations, quantities, qualities, events, and meanings are themselves constituted by the plurality of ways in which they are experienced. With all 3 examples, what all 3 examples reveal is how every mode of being equals an inessential modus operandi. Being is resolved into praxis, and praxis is substantiated into being. And at the same time, we are still dealing with modalities of something that remains constant regardless of its actual modifications. The stable form of language, the monolithical question of being, the originary nature of lived experience. They are modalities predicated on something else that remains constitutive of them and that transcends them. Husserl wanted to overthrow the Copernican theory in the usual interpretation of a worldview because it deterritorializes man from his horizon, whereas the original arche, Earth, does not move. As a consequence, classical substantialism and its oppositions of depth and appearance, essence and accident, ground and phenomena, being and becoming, potential and actual, form and matter, and subject and predicate persist. At times, they are suspended, but they are not overcome.
That was a beefy paragraph.
Let's contemporary analytical metaphysics, or so-called modal logic too, is still Aristotelian insofar as it moves within the holy trinity of ground, essence, and modality. Its three categories of modality are necessity, possibility, contingency, and impossibility, each of which is predicated on the primordial logical modality of identity or essence rather than existence. But modes are not categories, that is, concepts applicable to all possible things, like forms independent from their contents. Different ways of saying many things about the same thing, categories partake of one and the same mode of existence, that of essence. This amodal mode then tends to be seen as merely possessing a varying degree of reality on a scale from potency to act. To put it in words of Thomas Aquinas, each thing is perfect according as it is in act, and imperfect as it is in potency. Moreover, this division between ideal and real, in which the latter limits and selects the former, hides the problem of modal indeterminacy. In what ways does the possible exist in actuality? Traditionally, the mode of existence of the possible is qualified either by being separate from actuality according to modal priority, or by separating the multiplicity of possibles through the conceptual scaffolding of worlds. In Aristotle, actuality is for the most part prior to potentiality. For David Lewis, each world is actual to itself and possible to all others. Either way, only one world exists, the rest subsists. In both cases, this separation of possibility and actuality renders mysterious the mode of existence of potential, or indeed of anything non-actual or inessential considered in itself.
Oh, nice paragraph.
The crux of Mannerist philosophy lies precisely in the contestation of the separation of ideal and real. Agamben expresses it succinctly. If essence and existence have to be divided like potential and act, nothing is more problematic than their relation. What is at stake is the reality of the modes of individuation, which can be taken for granted neither in essence nor in existence, and which remain obscure as long as we derive the principle of individuation solely from what is already individuated. The problem is that, as Simondon says, anything that can serve as the basis for a relation is already of the same mode of being as the individual. In order to approach the operation of individuation, We must therefore modalize the relation itself between potential and the actual. What passes from potential to actual is not an essence, but the modality or sense in which being alters itself. As being is not, but must itself be effectuated and actualized, energia or power in action is no longer opposed to potentia. At the threshold of potential and act, modes are transgeneric principles contemporary with individuation. Each mode is its own more than logical genre in the sense of kind, not just a class of similar things, genera and species, but the real and continuous relationship that generates them. There are, in fact, just as many modes of existence or degrees of perfection as there are becomings, since modes are not quantities of essence but mutant potentialities in which quantity turns into quality, instead of vice versa.
I'm definitely going to have to make some notes on this. Holy.
Oh my goddamn! I wish I didn't read this one, because whenever I read,
this stuff
I
is
can't.
real dense, yeah.
Whenever I read, I can't
It's starting to
focus on it.
Mm-hmm. Does anyone else want to read the next paragraph?
We had finished off. So we were on the problem with logical essentialism, or did I miss a paragraph?
No, that's where we're.
You're right.
Yeah.
Cool. All right, so I'll go ahead and pick up then. The problem with logical essentialism is not just that, in reality, existence always precedes essence, but that essence is itself only one mode of existence, and a very limited mode at that. Essence not only hides the pre-individual field with which it forms a conduit, but also excludes becoming. Every mode is relation in becoming, a dynamic equilibrium of different potentials, not itself existence. It is a way of making exist. Ow. Simon Don shows that a genetic understanding of being must not be based on complete individuality, but on provisional resolutions of pre- and trans-individual tensions. Individuation must be considered as a partial and relative resolution that occurs in a system that contains potentials and encloses a certain incompatibility in relation to itself. An incompatibility made of forces of tension as well as the impossibility of an interaction between the extreme terms of the dimensions. This means, first, that to be is to relate and to be related to, such that being is never individual. And secondly, that a mode of existence is always only half individual and remains half pre-individual. Because of this rationality and metastability of modes, as opposed to the atomism and unchangeability of essences, nothing is ever fully concrete in itself. Things are always affected by a certain attraction, a tending to whatever tends their way. They are part of a series in which there are limited states, but no unique and superior ends. In turn, a mode is a law of a series, but as such, it is the realization of a system that has larger dimensions than any essence, as its tendencies the operation through which potentiality itself acquires reality and produces determinate, thing-like effects. Thus, neither the modality nor the existence of a table is the same as or similar to those of an electron, a language, a value, a word, a soul, a law, a fictional being, an idea, a phenomenon, a subject, an object, a work of art, or a god. No matter how fragile all these things are, only insofar as they effectuate and transform certain existential relations that define their unique reality. These relations do not inhere in them individually, however, but collectively. Neither things nor concepts, modes are perhaps best understood as habits. They are recursive systems that have an inoperative mode of existence. They are dispositions to behave in a certain way under certain types of circumstances, but also the ability to not do, to remain suspended in their own potentiality. Consequently, individuation and modality, the real and the possible, are inseparable but not the same. Being itself is not one or equal, but a multiplicity, not only of individual beings and their classes, but of capacities, operations, and interactions. To exist is to differ, writes the Neo-Leibnizian? Leibnizian. I'm going
Leibnizian.
Leibnizian, okay. Leibnizian Gabriel Tard, since it implies a vast multiverse made up of different modes of existence with no unified or unifying ground.
You did a great job. Thank you so much. Honestly, I think your
Shall I finish this page? This
yeah, please.
we're like one page away.
Go for it.
This operative sense of being as ontogenesis indicates that modal already meant modern. First formulated by Duns Scotus, for whom the freedom of every creature is at the center of the universe and immediately reveals God simply by being wholly and uniquely itself, the univocity of being marks the Copernican revolution in ontology because it forms a break with the scholastic thesis of analogia entis, according to which being is not said of God and finite creatures in the same way. Things exist in various manners, but these manners are not measured by the degree to which they participate in a more noble form. There still remains a formal distinction between common being and individuality, but on the condition that every individuation is a singular combination of the modalities in which it occurs, and that these modes are not immune to ongoing variation. Univocity, therefore, does not mean that ultimately everything is one or the same, like the night in which all cows are black. Being is never one. That is, it is not a genus, rather it is haesitas, a becoming such. Or
I think.
Is it haesitas? Haesitas?
It's a hexitas.
Hexitas, a becoming such, or thus in relational clustering, like a season or a flame, regardless of its duration, or a swarm or a pack, regardless of its regularity. Hexites are not numerically one, but the reasons for numerical difference, for the convertibility of being and unity. The ultimate unity of being is not collective but distributive. It consists of multiple becomings, one where each one is itself understood in the sense of an indeterminate article. For example, Deleuze's concept of a life, the charm of which does not belong to anyone, but is a purely intensive presence or event in a body, even when it appears in person. And becoming manifests the creative difference of this existence rather than the always more generic that. This is also implied by Bergson's famous multiple unity of duration. Every duration is perfect unto itself, while each of its shadings retains its own irreducible power or order of greatness. Mannerist ontology.
Sorry, just to like a quick note. So when it was italicized, I couldn't read it properly, but it is Hexaetes.
Is it?
I believe so. Yeah, I thought it was for some reason. I thought when it was italicized, it was doing a different thing, but then it didn't italicize, and I was like, oh, it's just Hexaetes. Okay. Just for reference, if that went over everyone's head, the idea of sort of a relational clustering or a like a individuated individual amongst a sea of the same would be similar to if you take like a wolf pack, for example, and there's like a leader of that pack. I know alpha theory is kind of thrown out the window. It's kind of based on some pseudoscience. But if you take like the leader of a wolf pack, there is a distinguished individual amongst a pack of wolves that is singular and standing out. Yet at the same time, it is no different from any of the other wolves, if that makes sense, right? Like that wolf that is leading that pack is no special or different genetically to any of the other wolves, yet they take like a particular social role in that presence. However, if that wolf is alone, you can't identify it as a leader all of a sudden, but nothing tangibly has changed about it. So that's kind of what is being discussed here.
Its status as being at the lead of the pack is predicated on there being a pack for it to be the lead of in the first place.
Yes, that's kind of yeah, that's practically it.
Yeah, if you look at wolf packs too, like each individual wolf in a wolf pack does have its like essential role in it, right? So you have the one at the front that's I might have this a little wrong, but if I remember, the one at the front is usually a younger, stronger one or something. Or no, you know what? Maybe even not the case, right? But the ones at the very back, they're basically there to protect the older ones that are in front of them, so they trail back a little bit.
Yes.
To protect
There's like a
the
group
middle
of
ones.
stronger wolves towards the front for being able to do front guard stuff and kind of taking point. And then there's a rear guard that's also made up of these very capable wolves, which I imagine would end up having the spot where something, whatever the wild's equivalent to an alpha would be in that case, that would be the kind of space they would reside in to be able to watch over their whole group.
Yeah, but each of them
But you
has
see
their
how
own
an
role
MD
that gives them this I guess sometimes that italicized word gets referred to as primitive thisness, which I like that phrase
Yes.
a lot.
Sort of like another example of a hexaity, if it helps here, is you know how we have hurricanes and we name them, we give them pretty names, human names like Hurricane Irma and Hurricane Sally. Every single time these hurricanes come to form, they are unique in and of themselves, right? The event of these formations are always different clouds, even though they're made up of ancient waters, right? From
Recycled
prehistoric
through
times.
trillions of times.
Absolutely. But the very nature of like being present in a storm is always a very unique experience, right? You can never stand in the same hurricane Irma twice, right? So even though we give them these names and we place this label upon them as if they are the same thing occurring again and again, it is not the case. So that would be another example of a hexaity.
Yeah.
Would you like to read the final paragraph, Jay?
Okay. Mannerist ontology could be said to be a genetic monism, since only becoming can assume the unity that envelops difference. As Heidegger says, the being of being is Zweifalt, being with alterity folded into it. Individuations by hexity do not take place against a common background populated with fixed essences. Rather, each on its own immediately effectuates this common background in its own way. But this also implies that becoming itself is multiple, since there is an infinite variety of ways in which, to put it with Whitehead, the many become one and are increased by one. As soon as they enter into new relations, hexities morph into different individuals. While these relations cannot exist except inside of individuals, they subsist outside of them and are irreducible to them. Every individuation potentially reshuffles the mereology of the world. The magic formula of modern philosophy, Deleuze and Guattari claim, is that pluralism equals monism. In a world in which substance revolves around modes instead of vice versa, there are just as many species as there are modes of individuation, since the only true substantive is multiplicity.
So that
Beautiful.
immediately reminds me of Walt Whitman's Leaves of Grass, and again, I've only read like very little pages.
Everything reminds you of Leaves of Grass.
Well, this is very it reminds me of the title, literally Leaves of Grass, right? Because for that book there was a sense of like radical democracy or American democracy. People kind of believed in it, and there was like a radical spirit to it. And if you think about the title Leaves of Grass, and if you think about it in terms of a field, yeah, if you look at one field, it is one cohesive whole. But if you zoom into that field, each blade of grass has its own difference, and when built together creates that massive, powerful, cohesive whole.
Absolutely. It was actually I was smoking the other day, which is a bad habit. But last week or something, I was out in the garden, and I was just like looking at the floor, and I was suddenly enamored with like the beauty of the world, because obviously the floor is often where we don't direct our attention, we just kind of waltz past it. But if you are forced to like stop and stare, you realize like how monstrous the thing beneath our feet really is. How like unique every section of the earth truly can be, in all its like scattered and sporadic manifestations, and all these like patches, like where the patches of grass actually are, and how the mud rises, and where the flowers bloom, and where flowers don't dare grow, and you know, I just
can't help. Sorry, go ahead.
Oh, it's okay.
I was just going to add in the fact that it's even gets crazier when you look at it all and consider the fact that even if somebody was to take the time to go into a particular natural space and measure everything perfectly and try to recreate it elsewhere, it still wouldn't be the same, even beyond the basis of like, well, it's in a physical location. The essence of it would kind of be made different by the act of doing it on purpose as opposed to it happening naturally.